Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our panelists for today. First, we have Reverend Dr. Galen Carey, Vice President of Government Relations for the National Association of Evangelicals. We also have with us Dr. Andrew Polk, Associate Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We also have with us Melissa Reed, who's the Director of Government Affairs for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Mr. Stephen Allred, who is the Director of Government Relations for the Church State Council. Good having you here with us and looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, there's a new piece of legislation where religious liberty is now being revived in Alabama for public school families. After legislation was tabled in the Alabama House Education Policy Committee to offer public school students the ability to participate in off-campus religious and character instruction during school hours. The issue has reemerged in the Alabama Senate with the full support of the Lieutenant Governor. And just recently, there was a new bill that was put in place by Senator Shelnut that has recommended 100% committed support. And he called the Alabama Senate to approve the measure as soon as possible. You know, when you start taking a look at these pieces of legislation that start dealing with topics along the lines of protection of families in public schools, you know, Steve, I imagine you've probably seen this happening in many different states, but when you take a look at what they're trying to do there in Alabama, where they start talking about trying to receive supervised or off-campus Bible-based character education, you know, it seems like even if it's an elective, that somehow it may be a bridge too far. Or am I missing something here?
You know, Orland, I think in many ways this tracks with what we've seen in some other states in the past. For example, in the 1950s, there was an off-school program or off-campus program like this in New York City, apparently. And the Supreme Court case, Zorak v. Clausen, you know, came to be as a result of that, where the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's fine under those circumstances. In this case, I think there is something a little bit different in that it looks like they're offering academic credit for those off-campus classes, which I don't believe the New York City program did. It's also interesting with some of the publicity surrounding it. I know the lieutenant governor down there was saying that he believed that this would be Bible-based education, even though the bill leaves it open-ended, doesn't say it's Bible-based. It just talks about kind of like religious instruction. So I guess my question would be, what happens if a mosque or, you know, some other non-Christian faith comes along and sets up shop near the school and starts offering academic credit for their, you know, religious instruction? Are we okay with that? And then I guess the next question for me is, why does the government need to be involved in promoting religious education or providing academic credit for it at all? Isn't that the job of the church? And should the church be stepping up to the plate here, you know, mentoring kids and discipling families? Because, I mean, I agree, the church needs to do that, but is that really the school and the government's job?
No, Galen, when you take a look at what's going on from this standpoint, the idea of Bible-based education having to be put in place for public schools, it just seems like, you know, although there's this confusion that a lot of people are bringing up regarding the separation of church and state, it does seem like it's pretty clear when you start deciding to use tax dollars for Bible-based activities, or even talking about assuming certain liabilities for after-school programs to engage in this. It seems as though we're starting to get a little bit more murky, or maybe this is just where society is going right now.
Well, Orland, I think we should take a step back and think historically about the origins of education in America. So sometimes secular people assume that schools were a secular idea and it was just created by government. And in fact, all schools began originally as religious schools, and long before we had even the idea of having public schools paid by tax dollars. So it's not necessarily bad that we have tax-supported public schools. I think it's been very good for our country. But we shouldn't think that religion doesn't have a place in education. So, as I understand what they're doing in Alabama, I actually don't have a problem with allowing students to take religious subjects. Certainly, I don't want any tax-paid teachers, public school teachers, teaching religion, at least religion as faith. Religion as history or literature is another thing, but religion as faith, that's not the role of a public school teacher. But I don't have problems with them getting credit if it's in fact a competent program, and certainly it needs to be open to all religions. It can't be only for certain religions. That would be a violation.
You know, Arlen, Steve mentioned this is kind of established law as far as the ability to be able to offer religious instruction off-site. There's some caveats, right? It has to be off-site.
Mm-hmm.
It has to not be state funded, right? There has to be parental consent. All of those sort of things. And it's been interesting when I'm looking back at this particular piece of state legislation there in Alabama. They really have been trying to make this happen for several years. And in fact, my understanding is the program itself has already been approved, has already passed, has been legislated. But what this iteration is talking about is actually making sure that the transportation to and from this offsite instruction is taking place with the third party or the outside party, as well as the liability for the students that are away. And it was interesting when I saw that, because it looked like that, as I said, the program has been in place for a few years, but none of the school systems are taking advantage of it in the way that I think lawmakers are wanting them to. There doesn't seem to be a lot of opting in, and so they're really trying to make it more and more palatable. And so I thought that was particularly interesting to see. The thing that's concerning about this for me, and again, I don't have a problem. I agree with the legality of being able to go and do this, and certainly agree with Galen in that religious education of our young people is essential. But my concern is when it was talking about who is overseeing or who's vetting or even approving these programs, right? Mm-hmm. And in the quotes that I was reading, the news stories that I was reading, it was saying that would be up to the local school board. And I think that's where we can see some problems, right? You know, is it only going to be the favored religions, right? Or is it going to be the mosque? Is it going to be the synagogue? Is it going to be the Seventh-day Adventist church? All of those sort of things, right? I think to me, that's where sort of the concerning thing is. That's where we're getting closer to that privilege or establishment clause issues.
I think there are two issues here, and Melissa just covered that well, right? There's the question of when you say religious education, mm-hmm. when you then turn around and say Bible-based, you don't mean religious education, you mean Christian education of a type, right? It's just there. So that's a problem in itself. But there's also the issue of credit here that Steve mentioned before. I don't quite understand how, right? In Galen, you mentioned this in just a second ago, right? If it's not okay for a teacher employed by the state to teach religion as faith, they should only teach it as education or as literature, right, or history. Mm-hmm. That's clearly not what this is. So if they can have religious education as faith from someone else that gives them credit in our curricular system, but as long as a person who's employed directly by the state doesn't do that, I'm not really sure which hairs we're splitting here, right? If there's an aspect of this that we are explicitly teaching religion as faith, even if that's available to all the people of different religious traditions in the area, if we're giving credit for that, what is the credit for? There's no curricular argument here that I quite understand. And it seems, therefore, just a way we want these kids to learn about the Bible, and this is the way we're going to do it and pay for it. It seems to be pretty clearly from that standpoint a skirt around of the law and not trying to go by the letter or even the intent of the law itself.
Well, of course, we have many classes in a typical school curriculum where the grading is principally on participation, like you go to physical ed. You know, it's basically, are you showing up and doing whatever the activity is? And so I think in the same way, we shouldn't assume that for a person to study and develop their faith, that's not irrelevant to the whole person development of someone. And so long as it's open to all faiths, I don't think there should be a problem that every student with their parents' consent has the opportunity to explore their faith in the context of a well-rounded educational program.
And I agree that I think being well-rounded is an important aspect of this. I think maybe what starts to make this a little bit more precise for me is the Bible-based language that they're talking about, which almost gives the impression that we want to allow something to be taught here. We weren't really getting a whole lot of people opting in. So maybe we can change around the parameters, make it easier for you to get there. And that seems to be the part where I'm wanting to make sure that we haven't crossed the line in turning into trying to figure out how to get more people to take these classes, as opposed to really allowing it to be just a general opt-in regarding faith. But Steve, that's where it starts to get a little bit tricky for me. And I'm not sure, it took Alabama a while to get a lot of this moving. And it seems like now we're doing transportation, maybe we'll just start bringing it to your home maybe the next thing. I don't know how we handle this.
Yeah, which is why I honestly think this is just not an area that government needs to get involved with. I mean, we know that the founders addressed something related to this, at least, back in Virginia, when they rejected the constitutional amendment to add in religious education, that Congress would fund or whatever. So it's, obviously different than what we're talking about here. That's not direct funding, whatever. But I mean, really, the founders created a free market for religion, where all religions, or even those who don't have any faith, can participate on equal footing. And a question I would have here is, what about the kid who has no faith? Listen, I'm a former pastor. I'm a Christian. I believe in proselytizing, but I just don't think that the government doing it or favoring certain faiths above others, as could happen in this case, is the way for it to be done. I think churches need to step up to the plate. Yes, let's have after-school programs. Let's have, campus ministries or whatever. I was a youth pastor, participated in Bible study, student-led Bible study groups on public school campuses. Here in liberal California, of all places, it happens, So God is working in public schools, but do we need the government to do this kind of thing? I'm not convinced that we do.
There's one question as to, is this the wisest thing for a school to do? And another is it acceptable? I guess I would argue it's acceptable, not necessarily that it's the wisest way for a school to organize its curriculum.
Melissa?
Yeah, I was just going to say, legal versus is this the most appropriate way? And this is happening at the same time where we're seeing church attendance just plummet, right? I mean, that was my understanding of where religious instruction, besides, of course, in the home, usually took place. So it seems to me, certainly I agree with the sentiment that we need to be spending time, in my faith tradition, in the Bible, in the Word, right? But it's odd to see that this, as I said, is happening at the same time as church attendance really decreasing.
We're going to let that be the last word, but I think that's the real question. Where are we trying to, quote unquote, indoctrinate individuals from a religious standpoint? Is it going to be in the churches, or are we going to be finding other public institutions in the public square? It was an interesting case that was entitled Gabriel Olivier versus the city of Braden, where you have Gabriel, who calls himself a Christian, who feels a duty to share his beliefs with those that he meets. And standing outside of kind of well-attended events, Olivier conveys the gospel of Jesus Christ, hoping to have peaceful conversations and reach as many people as possible. However, unfortunately for him, his evangelism had been silenced by the city of Braden in Mississippi, where they issued an ordinance that prohibited him from communicating his religious beliefs to others in a city park. The city prohibits individuals from engaging in religious speech, whether through oral dialogue, through signs, through literature, expressive clothing, or one-on-one conversations. It seems as though the city of Braden has made it very crystal clear that they don't want to see any type of activity from a religious standpoint happening in any place that's deemed to be public. Galen, when I start seeing this type of messaging, I get the idea that there should be a separation of church and state, but it seems as though there has to be something that's made available for someone to be able to express themselves if it turns out that they have some type of religious belief, which may be a fundamental part of who they are. And in this particular instance, it seems like the city, in what some would call the Bible Belt, is going all the way in the other direction to make sure that this doesn't take place.
So, Orlin, as you said, the right of people to share their faith is fundamentally at issue here. It's actually not what the court case is about. As Justice Sotomayor once said, once your case gets to the Supreme Court, it's no longer about your plaintiffs. It's about some obscure legal question.
Right.
So, first of all, on the right of people to share their faith in public, I think that's very important. And I think what the city has done is overly restrictive. You can understand there sometimes need to be some restrictions regarding movement of traffic and people and so forth. But as I understand the facts in this case, they were putting what they called a protest zone way off somewhere where nobody would hear what they were saying. And they even forbade the use of any loudspeaker that would carry sound for more than 100 feet. So it's really defeating the purpose of being able to share your faith. Now, it's another question again, is this the right and best way for a person to share their faith? That's another question. But if the plaintiff believes that it is, then he should have that right. The legal question here is a little more technical and has to do with how firmly established should convictions be when someone's convicted of something? Should they be able not to appeal their conviction, but to appeal a point of law that would implicate their conviction? And there's a circuit split on that. There's about 5 or 6 circuits on each side of that question. So that's what's being brought in front of the Supreme Court. And I guess I don't have a very strong opinion about that, except I don't think we should be restricting the right of people to appeal points of law just because in the past there's a conviction that may or may not be implicated in that appeal.
So, Orlin, I'm with Galen in that I don't have a strong opinion about the actual legal components of, what will be discussed in the Supreme Court. But I definitely have some thoughts on religious speech in public places. And it's one of the most protected or sacred things, right? The ability, as for Americans, the ability for us to be able to express ourselves in these spaces with few limitations. And in my reading of this situation, first of all, Mr. Olivier is unique in that this ordinance was actually passed because of him. Fortunately for him, one of the things that you cannot restrict is what is said, because if you took a look at the things that he was saying, I would not put that in the category of sharing your faith. But that said, that is not a restriction as far as whether or not he has the right to say that. The restrictions are for the city are allowed to regulate on time, on place, and on manner of speech. And by manner of speech, it mentioned like noise level. And so as Galen referenced, he had a loudspeaker, an amplifier, right, that he was speaking into.
Yep.
And he also was doing it, there was an amphitheater, and he was doing it as the crowds were coming in and out of the amphitheater. And so those are the things that the ordinance addressed, is saying you can be here at any time except for when this crowd surge is happening, and you can't use your mic to do it. And that still was not enough for him. And so I am not real sympathetic to the individual. I certainly am sympathetic to the right for people to be able to share their faith in public spaces, however.
Steve, they talk about the heck doctrine that they, I guess, were applying to Olivier in this particular case. And it seems as though it may be misplaced, or is it something where they were just trying to figure out, how do I put this person in a box to ensure that they don't have an opportunity to appeal? But the real question is, should that even apply here?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it looks like it's something that the Supreme Court's going to obviously weigh in on and let us know. But I think, going back to the overall facts of the case, it seems like, you look at a lot of the cases that make it up to the Supreme Court, and generally they're the extreme cases, right? Someone has done something that is kind of pushing the envelope to the extreme here. And in this case, here's a guy who's claiming to have religious speech, and it is religious, but it really doesn't represent most people of faith in our country. But unfortunately, in his case, his actions led the city to do these things that restricted the speech of all people, right, in that area. I think that's unfortunate. And so hopefully, even though that is not something the Supreme Court's probably going to weigh in on exactly, it looks like they're going to be talking about this Heck doctrine, right? Hopefully this will be corrected in some way.
But Andrew, that seems to be where the rub is right here. We have an individual who they've decided that we're going to craft some legislation that's pointed at one person. In reality, what you really end up doing is kind of creating a chilling impact on a larger community. It just seems like there may have been a more, appropriate method of handling this. But maybe we're such a litigious society, it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to find yourself in court anyway.
Yeah, I think this is a lot of the challenge that we're seeing now with these issues of religious liberty and religious speech, that in a community, some sense of mutual reasonableness is required, and that reasonableness isn't always there. In this case, I'm not sure it was there on either side, right? But it's a delicate balance. I teach at a state university in one of the buckles, the 17 buckles of the Bible Belt. Everyone claims to be a buckle of the Bible Belt. Including us, but there's a lot of fraud stuff. It's a college campus, but we have an area where someone of any faith can share within the reasonableness of, you can't be that loud, you can't attack students in some way. But even those issues of too loud or not attack students are somewhat vague, right? It takes another human being, some reasonableness to say, well, we're going to give you a warning, we're going to come through. The difficulty is in the large scale legal matters, to where those specifics of the actual individuals don't necessarily matter. But I think I've said this, a dozen times on this show. People immediately become symbols. It's not about human beings and the way that we talk and go through. They're symbols of a thing we have to take out. And I think that becomes the heart of a lot of these religious liberty issues. We're not talking about religion or liberty. We're just really trying to make PowerPoints, and people get lost in that flood.
There's a problem. I have a problem with creating free speech zones that then give the implication that that's the only place where you can have free speech. And free speech actually should go around with each of us wherever we go, subject to, reasonable standards, of comedy and so forth. But when colleges or cities do things like that, oftentimes I think it's sort of minimizing the right by confining it to a certain small space.
Melissa, that seems to be part of the issue. You're somebody who's down on Capitol Hill trying to assist individuals who engage in legislation. Is how do you end up advising people that what you're trying to do here is pointed at such a small pocket that in the end you may end up creating a bigger issue, if you have just kind of let this alone? It may have died off on its own.
Yeah, I think intent is something that we really have to think about it, and long-term consequences. And I was thinking when I'm looking at this, again, in all the press that I saw, this was labeled as a religious liberty case, right? It's not a religious liberty case. And I think the more and more that people, anytime they are inconvenienced in any way, or everything becomes this matter of religious liberty until nothing is religious liberty, right? Or those who are maybe less sympathetic to the religious freedoms that we hold here in America are just rolling their eyes because yet again, here's another religious freedom claim, right? And so I think that's a concern for me because we don't want those freedoms taken away. And so I actually agree. I'm comfortable with the ordinance that was put in place. The consequences was a fine that the individual paid, right? And then that was led to the legal issue as whatever. So the guy wasn't hauled off to jail. As far as I think those were reasonable requests that you don't use your mic or whatever that thing's called, and you don't aren't there right in the midst of a really heavy traffic time. All the rest of the time it was open up. I feel like that was a reasonable request.
Well, there was a suspended sentence included in the judgment, so he could have been sent to jail. And I guess if you're going to say, well, you can share whatever you want to share so long as no people are around, that also is kind of a moot
A little bit restrictive. Well, and wasn't there some sort of a remote protest area that he was supposed to go to? Was that all the time, or just
No,
that was only when there were
3 hours before and 1 hour after any public events.
Okay.
Yeah, and the whole idea of wanting to protest after everybody has gone home, I think, kind of defeats the purpose, right? So, this is part of the issue when you're trying to silence an individual based on some discomfort of individuals, and then you end up putting an ordinance in place that now has the impact to a larger group of individuals. It almost seems as though the legislative leadership that's happening in our country, both at the federal level and at the state level, may want to pump the brakes a little bit to realize that not everything I see deserves a piece of legislation. And if I am going to put it in place, let's make sure it cuts across the board in a very even fashion. Hey, Galen, tell me something I don't know.
1 out of 12 Christians in America is either themselves at risk of deportation or they live in a family with someone who is.
Wow. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
All right, Orlin. Well, LifeWise Academy is an organization that provides Bible instruction just specifically for these religious release time law states. And I was looking on their website, in the 2025-26 school year, they anticipate they will be in 1,100 public schools in the United States.
Wow. Steve, tell me something I don't know.
Speaking of extreme situations, this is a story about an extreme survivor. In 1977, U.S. Forest Ranger Roy Sullivan became a world record holder after he was struck by lightning for the 7th time and survived. And I've got thunderstorms right outside my house right now, so that was relevant to today.
Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
I'm still wondering what a person does to get struck by lightning 7 times. To not educate or help our audience whatsoever, but my son thought this was the funniest thing in the world. President Andrew Jackson had a pet parrot named Polly, because that's a cliche. Jackson thought it was hilarious to teach his bird to curse like a sailor. And he did so much that during Andrew Jackson's funeral, they had to take the bird out because he kept cussing out Jackson in his casket.
That one I've definitely never heard. Appreciate talking with you guys today. Really enjoyed the dialogue. And thanks you again for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.